Did Adam and Eve really sin in the Garden of Eden? Was there really a fall of humankind from God? I say no, and I'm going to tell you why. God is all-knowing. He knows everything before it even happens. When God created His creation, God said that it was good and perfect. But I think God had a plan for Adam and Eve and for people. The way that Adam and Eve were in that state, they were basically nothing more than pets, because they had no conception of how divine God was. They really had no free will, no knowledge of good and evil. There's no record of them praying, no record of worshiping, no record of adoration. More or less, God is caring for them. He grooms them. He provides for them. But they're not really growing. They're not really producing. They're not praying. They're not recognizing Adonai as Lord. Then along comes the serpent in his devious way, and he approaches Eve, which I think probably happened over a period of time. And Eve is very innocent, very naive. And the serpent basically lies to her, but he half lies, and he tells her, you know, this tree is really kind of cool looking, and maybe you should, admire it, and perhaps even indulge in its fruit. So what is the fruit? The fruit is the knowledge of good and evil. And by knowing good and evil, you will be like God, which is kind of a half a truth. So Eve looks at the fruit and says, yeah, man, it looks pretty good. Now, a lot of people believe that the fruit was an apple, which is a myth. Some people say that the fruit was a fig, which it could have been, but I tend to think that the Bible uses the word fruits just simply as maybe an idiom to mean knowledge. And she ate of the fruit, which means that she consumed this knowledge, and she became self-aware. And then she convinces Adam, and he's a real pushover, and he consumes this fruit, which is knowledge, and all of a sudden their eyes are opened, and they realize that they're naked, and they become afraid. And lo, the Spirit of God comes walking through the garden, and God already knows what has happened, even though He speaks out and He calls to them. But the reason why God calls to them is really to comfort them, because keep in mind, God knows all things. God is not fooled. The serpent hasn't fooled the Lord. Actually, it's the other way around. God has used the serpent to bring God's plan into action by making Adam and Eve self-aware. Now they can worship God and come into a higher level of being. Now they can know God as He really is, as the Creator, their spiritual Father, the Lord of all heaven, where before they were innocent and they really didn't know who God really was. So now God, instead of punishing them, which a lot of Christian people seem to think that Adam and Eve were punished by being cast out of the garden, it's really not a casting out. What God does is that He instructs them about what is now going to happen. And He tells Eve, that through pain you will give childbirth, and Adam and Eve will now have to work to till the ground. God is teaching them how they are going to have to care for themselves. And He's bringing them into another level of what I consider to be higher living, because here lies the opportunity that they didn't have previously. Now they can enter into a spiritual awakening, a new covenant, where they know God as divine, and they can reach out to Him as the Abba Father, as the Holy One, where before, as I said, they were naive and they were innocent, but nowhere does Scripture say that they worship God for who He really was. So I think that Christianity has kind of missed the mark on the Adam and Eve story. There really wasn't a fall. There was, in truth, an awakening. And without this awakening that was brought about by the serpent, who was actually used by God, even though the serpent thought that he was, kind of ruining God's plan, we would have no chance to grow in God, to know God, to worship God, and to be raised to a higher level in God. And I'm interested to know what others think about this point of view. And thank you for listening.